The clock is close to midnight, and the list is still unfinished. You know what needs to be done. You have known all day, and still, nothing moved. Science has been studying that gap between knowing and doing, and what it found is not what most people expect. The freeze is not a character flaw. It is a misfiring between two separate brain systems that were never designed to work together perfectly. The part that keeps you awake, the same mechanism that caused the delay today, is now the reason sleep won't come tonight. Welcome to Psychology for Sleep. Tonight follows the wiring, to where the freeze begins, what it costs the nervous system, and what the science says about closing the gap. Close your eyes and breathe slowly. You are where the day's unfinished weight has finally run out of room to push. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. And now we begin. You know that moment when you sit down to begin something and your body simply will not cooperate. The chair feels wrong. The air feels wrong. Your mind fills with everything except the task. Researchers studying task initiation delay have a name for this temporal self-discontinuity. What we now understand is that the brain does not automatically experience your future self as the same person as your present self. When you imagine future you completing the report, the brain activates the same neural regions it uses to think about a stranger, not yourself. The task belongs to someone you haven't quite met yet, and so the present self hesitates. If you have ever found yourself doing every minor thing except the one thing that matters, reorganizing your desk, checking email for the third time, making another cup of tea, science calls this displacement activity. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and execution, is in competition with the limbic system, which governs threat response. When a task feels emotionally loaded, tied to judgment, failure, or inadequacy, the limbic system activates first and fastest. The brain treats the unpleasant task as a low-level threat, and the body responds accordingly. Avoidance, distraction, anything that reduces the discomfort signal. There is a specific kind of tiredness that comes not from working too hard but from resisting. Psychologists call it decision fatigue combined with anticipatory anxiety. Every hour spent not starting a task, but aware that you should, costs cognitive energy. The prefrontal cortex remains partially engaged, running quiet background simulations of starting and not starting, calculating risk and consequence, rehearsing excuses. By the time evening arrives, the brain has spent hours at partial load on a task it never touched. The exhaustion is real. It was paid in a currency that left nothing visible to show for it. The science of procrastination is not about laziness. Studies from the University of Sheffield, published in Psychological Bulletin in 2023, confirmed across more than 700 studies that procrastination is fundamentally a failure of emotion regulation, not time management. People who procrastinate are not avoiding the work itself. They are avoiding the feelings the work triggers: fear of failure, perfectionism, shame, and self-doubt. The task is not the problem. The task is the door to a room the nervous system does not want to enter. Understanding this single distinction changes everything about how the freeze can be approached and treated. There is a particular quality to the afternoon when you know the day is becoming unrecoverable. You look at the clock and something in your chest tightens involuntarily. Researchers studying the procrastination-sleep connection have found that this tightening is physiological. Cortisol spikes in response to deadline proximity, even self-imposed ones. The stress hormone rises, not because work began, but because time contracted around the absence of it. Your nervous system is now simultaneously managing both the unfinished task and the growing anxiety about the time remaining to complete it. Two separate stress loads where only one originally began. The brain region most associated with procrastination is the amygdala, the same region that fires when you sense danger. Neuroimaging studies show that when procrastinators encounter a task linked to potential failure or judgment, amygdala activation is measurably higher than in non-procrastinators completing the same task. What this means is that the brain has learned to categorize certain tasks as emotional threats. The avoidance is not irrational. From the nervous system's perspective, it is exactly what it was designed to do: protect you from perceived harm. The problem is that the harm is imagined, and the protection has a cost. You may have noticed that procrastination has a particular texture in the evening, different from the avoidance of the afternoon. Evening procrastination often involves what researchers call bedtime procrastination, the deliberate delay of sleep, even when the body is tired, as a form of reclaiming personal time after a day of obligations. A 2024 study in sleep medicine found that individuals who reported high daytime procrastination were also significantly more likely to delay sleep onset by 1 hour or more on weeknights. The two behaviors share a mechanism: difficulty transitioning from one state to another when the transition feels like a loss. When the brain is in avoidance mode, it does not go quiet. It generates daydreaming, mental rehearsal, rumination, elaborate planning with no execution. These are the byproducts of a prefrontal cortex running without permission to act. Neuroscientists call this default mode network overdrive. The default mode network is most active when the brain is not focused on a task. But in chronic procrastinators, it tends to remain highly active even during attempted task engagement, making focus feel physically resistant. The mind keeps generating. The work does not move with it. The energy is real. Only the direction is wrong. There is a compound effect that most people don't see until they are living inside it. Incomplete tasks create what psychologists call open loops, cognitive representations of unfinished business that the brain tracks passively in the background. Research from Florida State University confirmed that these open loops consume working memory resources even when you are not consciously thinking about them. The more tasks remain incomplete, the more cognitive bandwidth is occupied by their presence. By evening, if the list remains largely untouched, the background load on the nervous system can be as heavy as active work, without any of the progress. And this is only the beginning of what the science of task avoidance reveals about the connection between what you didn't do today and why your nervous system cannot settle tonight. The pattern is not random. It is wired into the same threat response architecture that has been running continuously since this morning. The freeze and the sleeplessness arise from the same source. And understanding that source is the first step toward something genuinely other than punishment. Toward a response that finally reaches the actual mechanism. rather than simply adding more weight to an already loaded and exhausted nervous system. The future self problem has a measurable gap. Researchers at UCLA used brain scans to show that when people imagined their present self, the medial prefrontal cortex lit up with activity associated with self-relevant processing. When they imagined their future self 10 years from now, the activation pattern shifted, resembling how the brain thinks about a complete stranger. The tasks we assign to future me are literally being assigned to someone the brain does not yet claim as its own. This is not philosophy. It is neurology. It explains precisely why tomorrow always seems more available than today. Perfectionism and procrastination are not opposites. They are the same strategy, approached from different angles. Perfectionism sets the bar at a level that guarantees the task will feel inadequate before it begins. The result is a postponement that feels like standards maintenance. Research published in Personality and Individual Differences in 2023 found that maladaptive perfectionism, the kind linked to fear of failure rather than pursuit of excellence, was one of the strongest individual predictors of chronic procrastination across age groups. The work isn't delayed because it isn't ready. The work is delayed because starting confirms the possibility of failing. The body keeps a record of what the mind avoids. Studies measuring cortisol and heart rate variability in chronic procrastinators found elevated baseline stress markers compared to individuals who completed tasks closer to initiation. The body is not waiting patiently during the avoidance period. It is holding a low-grade stress posture. Muscles slightly tense, breath slightly shallow, attention slightly fragmented, continuously across the entire delay period. The work was never not happening. It was happening quietly inside the nervous system, persistently and without pause, without any of the release that genuine completion would have eventually provided. There is something particular about the kind of task that freezes people most reliably. Researchers have identified 3 categories with the highest avoidance rates: tasks with unclear starting conditions, tasks linked to external judgment, and tasks where the outcome feels personally defining. The common thread across all 3 is not difficulty. It is identity threat. When completing a task would reveal something about who you are, your competence, your worth, your value. The stakes become existential. The brain's protective response is proportionate to the perceived threat, and existential threats reliably receive the full amygdala response every time. The gap between intention and action is called the intention-behavior gap in behavioral science, and it has been studied extensively since the 1980s. What researchers now understand is that this gap is not primarily a problem of motivation. Most procrastinators are highly motivated. It is a problem of implementation. The specific conditions under which an intention becomes a behavior are missing. When, where, how, planning. Also called implementation intention, has been shown in over 100 randomized studies to increase follow-through rates by an average of 28 to 84%. The intention to work is not the same as the neural pathway for working. Sleep and procrastination are connected at the neurological level in a direction that surprises most people. It is not only that procrastination causes poor sleep. Sleep deprivation also increases procrastination the following day. A 2024 study in the Journal of Sleep Research found that even one night of reduced sleep quality was associated with measurably higher task avoidance behavior and significantly lower prefrontal inhibitory control. Next day, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for overriding limbic avoidance, requires adequate sleep to function at full capacity. Cut the sleep, and the override weakens considerably. The cycle then feeds itself. There is a version of procrastination that doesn't look like procrastination because it involves doing other genuinely useful things. Researchers call it structured procrastination or productive avoidance. The individual completes low-stakes tasks, emails, cleaning, organizing, while the high-stakes task remains completely untouched. The nervous system experiences temporary relief because real work is being done, but the open loop remains. And by evening, the coexistence of completed small tasks and one incomplete important one creates a particular cognitive dissonance, simultaneously productive and evasive. Genuinely busy and still somehow not done with what mattered. Dopamine plays a central role in procrastination in ways rarely discussed outside neuroscience. The dopaminergic reward system is calibrated for near-term, high-certainty payoffs. Long-term projects with uncertain outcomes provide little dopamine reward during the working phase. Only upon completion, immediate pleasures, social media, entertainment, comfort food provide reliable, frequent dopamine hits. The brain, when given a choice between a low dopamine work period and a high dopamine distraction, will reliably choose distraction unless the prefrontal cortex actively overrides the preference. Willpower is the prefrontal cortex spending its limited metabolic resources to maintain that override continuously against the gradient. The shame that follows a day of avoidance is not arbitrary. Neuroimaging studies have shown that self-referential negative thoughts, the kind that arise when you review what you did not accomplish, activate the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula simultaneously. These are the regions associated with physical and social pain. The feeling that you let yourself down is processed in overlapping neural territory with the feeling of being rejected or physically hurt. For the brain, the social cost of self-disappointment is registered with the same seriousness as real pain, not as metaphor, but as an actual neural equivalence. There is a phenomenon called revenge bedtime procrastination that researchers began formally studying in 2014, after a Chinese social media term went widely used. It describes the pattern of staying awake late as compensation for a day that felt controlled by obligations. When the day offers no personal time, the night becomes reclaimed territory, even at the cost of sleep. A 2024 study in Frontiers in Psychiatry found that individuals with high daytime autonomy deficits, those who felt their waking hours were largely dictated by others, showed significantly higher rates of bedtime procrastination than those with moderate control over their schedules. The sleepless night is sometimes a protest. The nervous system has a threshold for emotional load. Researchers studying allostatic load, the cumulative burden of chronic stress on the body, have found that prolonged avoidance of emotionally charged tasks contributes meaningfully to that burden. Each day a feared task goes unaddressed adds a small but real weight to the physiological load. Over weeks, This accumulates elevated baseline cortisol, disrupted HPA axis rhythm, and impaired immune function. The body does not consider undone tasks neutral. It treats them as unresolved threats and continuously allocates a portion of its stress response to their quiet, persistent, unrelenting presence. When you finally begin a task you have been avoiding, there is a physiological shift that happens within the first few minutes. Researchers have measured it. Heart rate variability increases, cortisol begins to stabilize, and the amygdala activation, maintaining the avoidance state, begins to decrease. The act of beginning, not completing, just beginning, changes the nervous system's assessment of the threat in real time. The brain updates its model. The task is no longer uncertain. It is in motion. The body responds to motion very differently than it responds to the prolonged, unresolved anticipation of motion that preceded it. The relationship between procrastination and self-compassion has been studied extensively over the past decade. Kristin Neff's research at the University of Texas and subsequent replications have consistently shown that self-critical responses to procrastination, the internal punishment for not doing what you should have done, reliably increase subsequent procrastination rates. Guilt and shame activate the same avoidance response as the original task. The cycle is not accidental. Criticism makes the self feel more inadequate. Inadequacy increases the emotional stakes of the task. Elevated stakes increase avoidance. Self-compassion, counterintuitively, reduces procrastination because it lowers the emotional threat level of imperfection. The connection between procrastination and sleep quality runs through the bed itself. Sleep researchers have identified a behavioral pattern called conditioned arousal when the bed becomes associated with activities other than sleep. Scrolling, ruminating, reviewing the day's failures. The brain begins to associate the bed with wakefulness. The body enters bed and receives the wrong signal. The environment that was supposed to trigger sleep instead triggers alertness. For individuals who spend evening hours in bed, avoiding tasks or reviewing what wasn't done, the bed gradually loses its function as a sleep cue and becomes a site of anxious activation instead. What this first arc of facts reveals is not simply that procrastination is bad for sleep. It reveals something more specific. The freeze and the wakefulness are the same event, occurring at different times. The morning's avoidance and the night's restlessness share a single root system in the nervous system's threat response. But the picture of why this happens, the deeper mechanism beneath the mechanism, has not yet been fully drawn. The next facts begin to trace it. The question becomes not why the body freezes, but what the freeze is actually protecting, and at what cost. Right now, the part of your nervous system that spent today holding the weight of what wasn't done is doing something involuntary. It is beginning to scan for safety. Not resolution, not completion. Safety. The signal that the threat is gone, or at least no longer requiring a response. You don't need to provide that signal consciously. The body looks for it in the darkness, in the slowing of the breath, in the absence of new demands. What you haven't heard yet is what happens inside the brain when the threat signal has been running for so long that the nervous system begins to mistake it for a baseline, and what that costs the sleep that should have come hours ago. That is where the next section begins. Now we continue. The threat response at the center of procrastination has a name in the research literature: the freeze response. Unlike fight or flight, which mobilizes the body for action, freeze is a dorsal vagal response, a conservation state associated with shutdown, immobility, and dissociation. Researcher Bessel van der Kolk and colleagues studying trauma responses noted that freeze shares neurological features with learned helplessness. The body stops trying not because it has given up in a willful sense, but because the nervous system has determined that action is futile or too costly. The desk chair becomes a kind of stasis. Chronic avoidance rewires the brain in measurable ways. Studies using diffusion tensor imaging, a neuroimaging technique that maps white matter pathways, have found reduced connectivity in the frontolimbic network of individuals with high-trait procrastination. This network links the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala and is responsible for emotional regulation and impulse override. The more frequently a person avoids, the weaker the override pathway becomes. Not through any single act of avoidance, but through thousands of micro-decisions that root around the discomfort rather than through it. Avoidance is not harmless waiting. It is a training program for more avoidance. The concept of future self-continuity has become one of the most studied constructs in the procrastination literature over the past decade. Hal Hirschfield's research at UCLA showed that individuals with higher future self-continuity, those who felt a strong psychological connection to the person they would become, consistently showed lower procrastination rates, better financial planning behavior, and better sleep habits. The link is not metaphorical. The brain regions involved in future self-simulation overlap with those involved in planning and motivation. When the future self feels like a stranger, planning for them feels like charity rather than self-care. There is a specific window of time each morning when the nervous system is most receptive to task initiation. Researchers studying circadian cortisol rhythms have identified the cortisol awakening response, a spike in cortisol in the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, as a natural preparation state for goal-directed behavior. Cortisol at this stage is not stress. It is a mobilization signal. Individuals who use this window for low-friction task initiation report significantly lower evening procrastination than those who delay first contact with the day's tasks into the afternoon. When cortisol has declined and the emotional stakes feel higher, procrastination has a sensory component that is almost never discussed. The body physically resists task initiation in ways that go beyond thought. Heart rate increases slightly. Muscle tension elevates in the shoulders and jaw. The breath becomes slightly more shallow. Researchers measuring physiological responses during task avoidance found that these responses are present even in mild procrastination. Tasks that the person describes as not anxiety-provoking. The body knows before the mind registers a reason. The somatic avoidance response is faster and less rational than the conscious narrative about why the task is being delayed. The role of perfectionism in procrastination is bidirectional in a way that creates a trap. Perfectionism drives postponement because starting reveals inadequacy. But the longer a task is postponed, the more perfect the eventual output would need to be to justify the delay. A task started on day 1 can be rough and promising. The same task, started on day 10, carries 10 days of built-up expectation. The postponement inflates the requirement. The inflated requirement makes beginning more frightening. The increased fear drives further postponement. Researchers call this the perfectionism-procrastination spiral, and it is self-amplifying. Sleep deprivation and procrastination share a third variable that connects them: reduced activity in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This region governs what researchers call cognitive control, the ability to override impulses, delay gratification, and sustain effortful behavior toward long-term goals. Studies have shown that a single night of poor sleep reduces activity in this region measurably the following morning. Chronic sleep debt compounds the effect. This is why tired people procrastinate more. The biological override mechanism is weakened by the same force that the procrastination is producing. The loop is not poetic. It is neuroanatomical. There is a quality to the end of a day when the list remains largely unaddressed that is distinct from ordinary tiredness. Researchers studying what they call task incompletion rumination have found that unfinished tasks produce intrusive thoughts at a higher rate in the evening and pre-sleep period than during the day. The Zeigarnik effect, first described by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik in the 1920s and extensively replicated since, shows that the brain preferentially holds and returns to incomplete tasks over complete ones. The evening mind reviews what was not done, not to punish, but because the brain is genuinely trying to find a resolution it cannot manufacture. The list replays because the loop is still open. There is a well-replicated phenomenon in motivation science called the progress principle. Teresa Amabili's research at Harvard Business School, following creative professionals across hundreds of workdays, found that the single strongest predictor of positive inner work life was not big achievements. It was making progress on meaningful work, even small progress. A single step forward, one paragraph written, one email sent, one call completed, changed the brain's assessment of the day more powerfully than any other factor. The nervous system tracks momentum, and even the smallest genuine forward movement creates a different chemical environment than a full day of paralysis. The language people use about their own procrastination reveals a great deal about its nature. Phrases like, "I just couldn't make myself do it," and "my body wouldn't move," are not metaphors. They describe an accurate physiological state. The voluntary motor system, responsible for initiated, self-directed movement, can be suppressed by sufficiently strong limbic activation. When the amygdala assesses a situation as threatening enough, the motor cortex receives competing signals that interfere with initiation. The phrase "frozen with fear" reflects a neurological reality. The body was not making a choice. It was being overridden. The relationship between procrastination and time perception is one of the more counterintuitive findings in the research. People who procrastinate do not perceive time as passing too quickly. They perceive it as passing too slowly during the avoidance period. A task that takes 40 minutes is estimated to take 3 hours. The anticipated unpleasantness expands in imagination beyond what the actual experience would contain. Researchers call this hot-cold empathy gap, the inability of the present self, in a hot emotional state of avoidance, to accurately predict how the future self, in the cooler execution state, will actually experience the work. The task is harder in imagination than in reality. Emotion regulation, not time management, is the core skill deficit in chronic procrastination. This finding, established in multiple independent meta-analyses since 2021, has significant implications for how procrastination is approached. Strategies that focus purely on scheduling, deadline setting, or behavioral accountability show modest and often temporary effects. Interventions that address the emotional relationship to the task, fear of failure, shame tolerance, self-compassion practices show larger and more durable effects. The problem was never that people didn't know what to do. The problem was that doing it felt intolerable. The human brain has two interacting systems for evaluating the future: a visceral system that responds to immediate emotional cues, and a deliberative system that calculates long-term consequences. Behavioral economist David Lain called the tension between them hyperbolic discounting. The tendency to overvalue present comfort and undervalue future benefit in a non-linear, predictable way. Procrastination is hyperbolic discounting in action. The immediate relief of not starting is weighted more heavily by the visceral system than the future reward of completion, even when the deliberative system can clearly calculate that the trade is unfavorable. Night is a particular kind of amplifier for unresolved things. The brain's executive functions, the prefrontal resources that suppress irrelevant thoughts during the day, decline with fatigue. By late evening, the suppression network is weaker, and thoughts that were held at bay resurface with greater force. Tasks that were partially suppressed during the day reappear not gently but insistently. Sleep researchers studying pre-sleep cognitive arousal, the technical term for the mental activity that delays sleep onset, have found that task-related intrusive thoughts are one of the primary drivers of sleep latency in otherwise healthy adults. The night does not create the thoughts. It simply stops filtering them. Halfway through tonight, the pattern that connects the morning's freeze to the midnight's wakefulness has begun to take shape. The same threat response system that activated to protect you from the fear of inadequacy this morning is the same system now keeping you alert when the body needs rest. The freeze and the restlessness are not separate problems. They are the same nervous system responding to the same unresolved signal. The question the second half of tonight carries deeper is this: if the freeze was always protection, protection from what? Exactly. And what does it cost the self that is trying to sleep? Something is still with you. Take one slow breath. Your brain has been carrying the weight of an open loop today, and it is doing exactly what it was built to do. Tonight we follow it all the way through. Just stay here. Gently. The concept of self-regulation failure as the mechanism of procrastination has been formalized in a model by Roy Baumeister and colleagues known as ego depletion theory. The central claim is that the capacity for self-regulation, overriding impulses, maintaining effort, resisting distraction, draws on a limited cognitive resource that is depleted through use. Tasks attempted later in the day, or after other self-regulatory demands, face a depleted override system. This is why procrastination is most severe in the evening, not because motivation is lower, but because the cognitive infrastructure for override has been used throughout the day. The tank empties. The default mode network, the brain's resting state activity, is heavily involved in self-referential thought. When you are not focused on a task, the default mode replays memories, imagines future scenarios, and processes social information. In individuals with high trait procrastination, resting state fMRI shows that the default mode network has an unusually strong functional connection to the amygdala. The result is that even during downtime, the resting brain generates emotionally charged simulations of the avoided task. Rest does not rest. The avoidance follows the person into the spaces between tasks, keeping the emotional load continuously active. A 2023 longitudinal study tracking over 3,000 adults across 5 years found that habitual procrastination was associated with significantly higher rates of hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and musculoskeletal disorders compared to non-procrastinating controls after adjusting for other lifestyle variables. The mechanism is allostatic load, chronic low-level stress, maintained by persistent open loops, and their associated cortisol output. The body does not distinguish between an unresolved work task and an unresolved threat in the environment. Both activate the HPA axis. Both accumulate over time. The body receives the same signal from an ignored report that it receives from a predator, at lower intensity, but with no off switch. Implementation intentions. The practice of specifying not just what to do, but when, where, and how, form a bridge between intention and action that bypasses the need for willpower. Peter Gollwitz's decades of research at New York University showed that the act of specifying "I will do X at time Y in location Z" forms a conditioned link in the brain that partially automates the initiation, reducing the moment of action decision load to near zero. The brain no longer has to choose whether to begin. It simply recognizes the cue and executes. The enemy of procrastination is not motivation. It is the presence of a specific enough signal to start. There is a version of procrastination that develops in response to chronic overwhelm rather than task aversion. Researchers call this paralysis, procrastination, or overwhelm-induced avoidance. When the total volume of tasks exceeds the brain's capacity to prioritize them efficiently, the system can shut down entirely, not from unwillingness, but from an inability to identify a starting point. Every task appears equally urgent and equally impossible. The nervous system, unable to sequence the cue, defaults to inaction. This is not laziness. It is a triage system that has received more input than it can process. The future self-continuity research has produced one of the more counterintuitive interventions in procrastination science. Researchers at Stanford found that asking individuals to write a letter to their future self, specifically, to imagine that self as a real, sympathetic person rather than an abstraction, measurably increased the probability of completing a challenging task in the following 48 hours. The neurological bridge between present and future self, once activated through narrative, appears to shift the cost-benefit calculation that underlies postponement. The task is no longer assigned to a stranger. It is assigned to someone the present self is beginning to care about. The shame response in procrastination deserves particular attention because of what it does to the completion rate. Studies consistently find that shame, the experience of the self as fundamentally flawed, is associated with lower task completion rates than guilt. The experience of a specific behavior as wrong, Guilt creates a correction impulse. I did something wrong. I can fix it. Shame creates an avoidance impulse. I am wrong. And engaging with this task confirms it. The internal voice that says, "You are so lazy," is not a motivator. It is a further tax on the system that is already struggling to begin. The body's experience of procrastination changes over the course of a day in a predictable pattern. Morning avoidance tends to be accompanied by high tension and active distraction. The nervous system is energized but misdirected. Afternoon avoidance shifts to a flatter quality, dulled motivation. Reduced cognitive brightness. A kind of heaviness without urgency. Evening avoidance carries anxiety of a different flavor. The math of the day has become unavoidable, and the body knows it. Researchers tracking diurnal patterns in procrastination behavior found that task avoidance behavior peaks in the late afternoon and again in the late evening, corresponding to circadian valleys in executive function and cortisol. Attention deficit traits, including ADHD, are among the most strongly correlated neurological factors with procrastination, though the relationship is more nuanced than direct causation. Research published in the Journal of Attention Disorders found that procrastination in individuals with ADHD profiles is primarily driven by interest and urgency rather than importance or deadlines. The brain's dopamine regulation in ADHD creates an attention system that responds to novelty and immediacy rather than priority. Tasks that are important but not immediately stimulating tend to fall out of attentional focus entirely, not from avoidance, but from a neural filtering system that simply does not route them to the front of the queue. The research trail has led to a central and uncomfortable revelation: the body that freezes during the day and the mind that cannot sleep at night are not separate problems requiring separate solutions. They are one problem: the nervous system's unresolved response to perceived threat. And the threat is the self, not a task, not a deadline. The threat is the possibility that completing the task reveals something true about your value or your capacity that you have been managing not to see. That is the question the second half of tonight carries. What would happen to the freeze if the stakes were no longer existential? What just opened? The possibility that the freeze is not about the task at all, but about what the task might confirm. Maybe something you are carrying right now, not as a thought, as a weight. The particular kind of person who lies awake at midnight reviewing what wasn't done is rarely someone who doesn't care enough. They are almost always someone who cares too much, for whom the gap between what they are and what they believe they should be feels, in the dark, impossibly wide. Notice your jaw. Let it be softer. The second half of tonight follows what the science found on the other side of that gap. What happens to the freeze when the threat turns out to be smaller than the nervous system believed? Now we continue. The disconnect between present self and future self that drives procrastination is not fixed. Research published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience showed that targeted interventions, including visualization practices, mental simulation of future states, and written future self-correspondence, produced measurable increases in future self-continuity scores over a period of 4 weeks. The neural gap between now and then is not an immutable structure. It is a representation that changes with attention. The future self that feels like a stranger can, with practice, become recognizable. the emotion most closely associated with task avoidance is not laziness or apathy, but anxiety. Specifically, anticipatory anxiety about performance evaluation. A meta-analysis of 216 studies found anxiety to be the strongest, consistent emotional predictor of procrastination across cultures, age groups, and task types. The brain treats evaluation anxiety the way it treats physical threat. Activate the freeze. Reduce the exposure. Wait for the threat to pass. Understanding this does not dissolve the pattern, but it changes the frame. The person is not failing to begin. They are protecting themselves from a threat that feels real, even when the threat is imagined. Sleep is the primary repair cycle for the emotional processing that accumulated during the day. During REM sleep, the brain replays emotionally significant events in a neurochemical environment, low in norepinephrine, the stress hormone, allowing emotional memories to be reprocessed without their original charge. Matthew Walker's research at the University of California, Berkeley, describes this as overnight therapy. The same memories that feel raw and charged in the evening return in the morning with reduced emotional intensity. The day's unresolved tasks do not only block sleep, they are also the material sleep would process if allowed to arrive. The window between lying down and sleep onset, sleep latency, is one of the most reliable indicators of the nervous system's current regulatory state. Normal sleep latency is between 10 and 20 minutes. Chronic procrastinators with high evening rumination show sleep latency averaging 30 to 50 minutes. According to 2024 data from a large sleep study at the Karolinska Institute, the extra time is not spent in comfortable waiting. It is spent in involuntary review of the day's open loops. The brain has not been given permission to close the files, and so it continues to index them. There is a particular kind of self-compassion that is therapeutically active in procrastination, not permission-giving, but accurate seeing. Kristin Neff distinguishes between self-indulgence, which avoids consequences, and self-compassion, which acknowledges the full picture without self-punishment. The research shows that people who respond to their own procrastination with curiosity rather than criticism, asking what was I protecting myself from rather than what is wrong with me, show faster behavioral recovery and lower repeat procrastination rates. The softening is not weakness. It is precision. It gets at the actual mechanism rather than adding more aversion to an already aversive situation. One of the most counterintuitive research findings in this field is the relationship between perfectionism and productivity. High perfectionists produce less over time than moderate standard individuals, not because they work less, but because they start less. A 2023 study tracking academic output over a 3-year period found that researchers with high perfectionism scores published fewer papers, completed fewer projects, and reported significantly higher burnout rates than those with moderate performance standards. The pursuit of perfect outcomes delays and often prevents the production of good ones. The standard, intended to guarantee quality, becomes the mechanism that suppresses it. The neuroscience of getting started has been studied in enough granularity to reveal something specific. The hardest moment is not the middle of the task or the end. It is the first 4 minutes. Researchers measuring neural engagement during task initiation found that the prefrontal amygdala conflict that produces avoidance largely resolves within the first 3 to 5 minutes of genuine engagement. The brain updates its threat assessment based on real data. The task is not as dangerous as anticipated. The emotional cost begins to decrease. Starting does not require the courage to complete. It only requires the willingness to cross the 4-minute threshold. The relationship between sleep quality and next-day cognitive control is not linear. It is disproportionate in its early stages. Research from the Max Planck Institute showed that even 90 minutes of lost sleep was associated with a 30% reduction in prefrontal inhibitory control the following day. This means that a night of moderate sleep disruption produces a measurable reduction in the very cognitive resource needed to override procrastination. One poor night cascades into a higher procrastination day, which generates more cognitive load and more evening rumination, which disrupts the next night. The cycle is not metaphorical, it is mechanistic. The experience of completion has a physiological signature. When a task is completed, the prefrontal cortex signals a resolution of the open loop to the hippocampus and the anterior cingulate cortex. Dopamine is released. Heart rate variability improves. Cortisol begins to normalize. The body knows the difference between a day that ended with something finished and a day that ended with everything pending. Completion is not just a psychological event. It is a regulatory event. A real-time update to the nervous system's threat inventory that permits a genuine transition toward rest. Rumination and procrastination share a neural signature that places them in the same behavioral family. Both involve the default mode network in sustained self-referential processing. Both activate the anterior cingulate cortex in response to perceived gaps between current state and desired state. Both tend to intensify in the absence of distraction. And crucially, both are maintained by the same avoidance mechanism. The uncomfortable feeling generated by the gap is so aversive that the brain attempts to manage it without closing it. It rehearses and replays, but does not act. The loop runs. The gap remains. Procrastination has a relationship with identity that goes beyond task completion. Psychologists studying identity-based motivation have found that when a behavior is perceived as inconsistent with one's identity, people like me don't struggle with this. The gap between behavior and identity creates an additional layer of avoidance. The task is no longer just a task. It is evidence of a discrepancy between who you are and who you believe you should be. This identity threat is particularly pronounced in high achievers, for whom the image of competence is central to self-concept. The more important it is to appear capable, the more threatening it is to begin something uncertain. The circadian timing of cognitive tasks matters more than most people account for. Research on ultradian rhythms, the 90-minute cycles of high and low cognitive efficiency that run throughout the day, shows that task engagement during a high phase period requires significantly less regulatory effort than the same engagement attempted during a low phase. Procrastinators who consistently attempt to begin work during naturally low cognitive phases experience disproportionate resistance. Not from the task, but from the timing. Aligning task initiation with the body's natural high phases is not a productivity hack. It is working with the neurological reality of how attention is generated and maintained. The compassion-based approach to procrastination that has emerged from research in the last decade is not a softening of standards. It is a more accurate description of what actually works. A randomized controlled study published in Psychological Science in 2023 found that participants who received an intervention combining self-compassion with implementation intentions showed a 40% greater reduction in procrastination behavior over 12 weeks compared to a group using implementation intentions alone. The mechanism self-compassion reduced the emotional threat level of the task sufficiently to allow the implementation pathway to activate. The brain can follow a plan when the plan does not feel like an exposure to judgment. There is something the body knows about incompletion that the mind spends enormous energy trying to manage around. Somatic experiencing research, studying how the nervous system processes unresolved stress, has found that unfinished tasks leave a physical residue in the body analogous to the incomplete stress response cycle described by Emily Nagoski. The stress that was initiated by the threat of the task, the cortisol spike, the muscle tension, the shallow breath, was never given a completion signal. The nervous system initiated the stress cycle and was then asked to stop before resolution. This incomplete cycle accumulates. The body holds what the mind did not resolve. The neuroscience of motivation distinguishes between two systems, want and like. The wanting system, driven by dopamine, creates approach behavior and craving. The liking system, driven by opioid circuits, creates pleasure and satisfaction upon receipt. Research has shown that these two systems can become decoupled. A person can desperately want something without enjoying it, and can enjoy something without wanting to pursue it. In procrastination, the wanting of completion is often genuine. The liking of the process is absent, and the brain needs both to initiate the want toward the goal and some anticipation of satisfaction in the moving. Sleep architecture itself is altered by chronic procrastination and the stress it generates. Studies using polysomnography on adults with high-trait procrastination found reduced slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most physically restorative stage, and increased sleep fragmentation compared to low procrastination controls. Slow-wave sleep is the period during which growth hormone is released. Immune function is consolidated, and lymphatic clearing of metabolic waste from the brain occurs. The night that follows a day of avoidance is not just shorter subjectively, it is measurably less restorative at the cellular level. The debt is collected at depth. The psychology of self-forgiveness has direct, practical relevance to procrastination cycles. Research by Michael Wohl and colleagues at Carleton University, the institution that has produced some of the world's most influential procrastination research, found that students who forgave themselves for procrastinating on a first exam were significantly less likely to procrastinate on the second exam. The mechanism is direct. Self-forgiveness removes the shame avoidance cycle that would otherwise carry the pattern forward. The act of forgiving is not permissive. It is corrective. It severs the link between past behavior and future threat. The glymphatic system, the brain's waste clearance network, operates predominantly during sleep, and its function is compromised by sleep fragmentation. Studies using in vivo imaging in humans have found that the glymphatic system clears significantly more metabolic waste, including amyloid beta and tau proteins associated with neurodegenerative risk, during consolidated slow-wave sleep than during fragmented or shallow sleep. A night shaped by procrastination-driven rumination is a night of reduced waste clearance. The brain that spent the evening rehearsing what wasn't done is the brain that wakes with more metabolic load than the brain that was simply allowed to complete its cycles. There is a concept in cognitive science called the planning fallacy, first described by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which refers to the systematic underestimation of how long tasks will take and overestimation of motivation to complete them. Planning fallacy is one of the cognitive roots of procrastination. The future self is imagined as more capable, less tired, and less afraid than the present self currently is. The task is assigned to them. And when the future arrives, and the self is as ordinary as the present self always was, the task remains undone once more. The research on procrastination and physical health has expanded substantially in the past decade. A large-scale Swedish study, published in JAMA Network Open in 2023, followed over 3,500 university students across 1 year and found that baseline procrastination scores predicted not only academic outcomes, but also mental health deterioration, pain symptoms, sleep problems, and sedentary behavior at 12 months. The relationship held even after controlling for depression, anxiety, and socioeconomic status. Procrastination is not a productivity problem with emotional side effects. It is a health variable with consequences that distribute across multiple systems of the body simultaneously. The moment of deciding not to start a task is rarely experienced as a decision. It is experienced as a drift. The afternoon becomes the evening without a conscious choice having been made. Research on what psychologists call passive procrastination, avoidance through inaction rather than active distraction, suggests that many procrastination episodes are not deliberate. They are the absence of deliberateness. The moment that would have required a choice was never noticed, and the window passed. This is why intention setting at specific times is more effective than general resolve. The drift is not stopped by wanting to stop it. It is stopped by placing something in its path. Emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between different emotional states with precision, is a protective factor against procrastination. Research by Lisa Feldman Barrett has shown that individuals with higher emotional granularity are better able to identify the specific feeling triggered by a task. Fear of judgment versus ambiguity, discomfort versus boredom versus overwhelm, and respond to it more precisely rather than through global avoidance. The person who can say, "I'm avoiding this because I don't know where to start," has a different and more tractable problem than the person who only experiences, "I don't want to do this." Naming reduces the threat. Precision creates action. The relationship between procrastination and creativity deserves a careful distinction. A specific form of procrastination, what Adam Grant at the Wharton School calls incubation procrastination, appears to have a genuine cognitive benefit in creative work. The brain, during periods of rest between active problem engagement, continues processing in the default mode network, making unexpected connections that conscious focused work would not produce. This is distinct from avoidance procrastination. Incubation requires prior engagement with the problem, not avoidance of it. The mind that genuinely wrestles with a challenge and then rests produces differently than the mind that never begins. Self-regulation is not a fixed trait. It is a skill that responds to training, environment, and the structure of the task itself. Research in implementation science has consistently shown that external structure, specific schedules, environmental design, social accountability, progress tracking, dramatically improves task completion rates in people with high trait procrastination. The implication is not that willpower is the solution. It is that willpower's absence is the expected condition, and systems are the appropriate response. Designing around the brain's default behavior rather than fighting it is not surrender. It is accurate engineering. Procrastination is not a failure of wanting. Every person who spent a day in the freeze wanted to complete the work. What failed was the bridge, the neural and emotional pathway between the self who cares about the outcome and the self authorized to begin without perfect conditions. The science of the past 2 decades confirms something the listener lying awake tonight may have suspected. The bridge is not built through more pressure. It is built through reducing the threat. When the task no longer carries existential judgment, the body moves toward it. The way it moves toward everything that feels safe enough to touch. The task avoidance cycle has a natural flaw. Every day, at some point, the nervous system exhausts its ability to maintain the threat signal, not because the task is resolved, but because sustained alertness is metabolically expensive and the body eventually decides the threat is not immediate enough to keep running the alarm. This is happening right now, without effort from you. The final facts tonight arrive at a different register. Not the science of why the freeze happens, but the quieter evidence of what life looks like on the other side of it. They don't require anything from you except to receive them. We're almost there. People who have learned to work with their procrastination rather than against it describe a consistent shift. The task stops being the enemy. The moment initiation is decoupled from self-judgment. The experience of working changes. Research measuring subjective task experience found that individuals trained in self-compassionate initiation, beginning without requiring perfect conditions, reported significantly lower distress during work and higher task satisfaction upon completion. Even when the output quality was unchanged, the work was the same. The nervous system's experience of it was different. The science of micro-commitments offers one of the most practical replicated findings in procrastination research. Committing to a very small initial action, 2 minutes, 1 paragraph, a single email, bypasses the amygdala's threat assessment because the cost is too low to register as threatening. Once action begins, the threat model updates. The task is real, not imagined. And reality is almost always less frightening than anticipation. The 2-minute rule works not because 2 minutes is meaningful in itself, but because beginning reclassifies the task from threat to forward progress. The night always offers a kind of accounting the day doesn't require. In the dark, the brain returns to what it has not resolved. But the accounting is not punishment. It is function. The brain attempts to close loops because closing loops frees the neural resources they occupy, allowing rest. Understanding this doesn't silence the review, but it changes its character from something being done to you to something the brain is doing for you, imperfectly, in the only window it has. The role of meaning in overcoming avoidance is consistently underestimated. Research by William Damon at Stanford found that when a task is connected to something genuinely meaningful, beyond performance evaluation, beyond external reward, the threat response associated with it decreases significantly. Meaning changes the neurological cost-benefit calculation. A task that matters to the future self is one the nervous system is more willing to move toward. The gap between present and future self narrows when the future self is engaged with something worth caring about. The body's capacity for sleep increases measurably after even partial task completion. A study tracking sleep quality and efficiency found that participants who completed at least one previously avoided task before bed showed shorter sleep latency, higher slow-wave sleep percentages, and lower nighttime cortisol compared to those who continued avoiding. The completion did not need to be total. It needed to be real. The nervous system responds to forward movement. A single closed loop is enough to change the internal signal from unresolved to in progress. Fear of success is a real and documented form of procrastination that is rarely discussed openly. Psychologists working in performance and creative contexts have found that some individuals avoid completing work not because they fear failing, but because they fear what success would require more visibility, more expectation, more from themselves. Success carries its own threat to the avoidance system. This pattern is most common in individuals who experienced inconsistent reward for achievement in early life, where success sometimes brought increased pressure rather than stable safety. The brain's default mode network, the resting mind, is not passive. It consolidates the day's experiences, processes emotional content, and connects new information to existing knowledge. When this resting state is disrupted by procrastination-driven rumination, consolidation is also disrupted. Memories are less cleanly processed. Emotional content is less integrated. The next day begins from a partially processed baseline, carrying more unfinished emotional business than a properly rested brain would. Rest is not the absence of activity. It is a different and necessary kind of activity. There is a concept in positive psychology called flourishing, the full engagement of human potential across multiple life domains. Research on procrastination and flourishing found a consistent inverse relationship as procrastination increased. Flourishing decreased across productivity, relationships, health, and meaning. The reverse was also found in individuals who maintained a functional relationship with avoidance, not eliminating it, but working consistently with it, showed flourishing scores matching non-procrastinators. The goal is not to be someone who never avoids. The goal is to be someone who can begin. The nervous system's capacity for re-regulation, returning from stress to calm, is preserved by consistent sleep. Research by Alyssa Eppel and colleagues at UCSF found sleep quality was one of the strongest predictors of next-day cortisol recovery. Individuals who slept well showed faster normalization after morning stress. This matters for procrastination because the emotional threat level of a task is partly a function of baseline cortisol. The well-rested brain approaches the avoided task with a lower starting threat level. The tired brain does not have that advantage. The procrastination that lives at the intersection of exhaustion and perfectionism is perhaps the most common form in high-functioning adults. The person is capable. They know what the task requires. And yet their standards, combined with biological depletion, produce a paralysis that feels like laziness, but is actually its opposite, a system so primed for quality it cannot begin without assurance of it. In a body too depleted to provide that assurance, the freeze is not the failure. It is the gap between caring and having the resource to act. The act of writing down an unfinished task has a measurable neurological effect. Research by Masicampo and Baumeister found that writing a specific plan for completing an interrupted task significantly reduced its intrusion into subsequent thoughts. The brain doesn't need the task completed to free the resource it was occupying. It needs to know a retrieval plan exists, that the information won't be lost if attention moves. Writing signals the hippocampus the loop can be safely suspended. It doesn't close the loop. It creates a placeholder that allows the system to rest. The quality of self-talk in the pre-sleep period is one of the most modifiable variables affecting both sleep onset and next-day task behavior. Research on mental contrasting, developed by Gabriele Oettingen, showed that individuals combining positive visualization with honest acknowledgement of obstacles performed significantly better on subsequent task initiation than those using purely positive or purely negative self-assessment. The self-talk that helps is neither criticism nor false assurance. It is accurate. This is what is needed. This is what stood in the way. This is the next step. The nervous system that spent the day carrying an unfinished task is not a failed system. It took the threat seriously, perhaps more seriously than warranted, but sincerely, and in its own protection. The research consistently returns to a finding that resists making procrastination a story of weakness. The people most likely to freeze are often those most invested in the outcome. The depth of avoidance reflects the depth of caring. The task was not avoided because it didn't matter. It was avoided because it mattered too much. The transition from avoidance to action does not require courage in the dramatic sense. Researchers studying behavioral activation found that the emotional shift people associate with getting motivated typically follows action, not precedes it. The feeling of readiness arrives after beginning, not before. Waiting to feel ready is waiting for a signal that behavioral neuroscience says comes from the other side of the threshold. The decision is not to feel ready. The decision is to move before the feeling arrives, and trust that it follows. There is something in the late night hour that cannot be fully explained by cognitive science. When the house has gone quiet and the only sound is your own breathing, the gap between who you are and who you want to be feels both very large and very small. Very large because the day's record is fixed. Very small because the brain, at its most tired, sometimes reaches an honesty unavailable during the defended hours of the day. The science names it cortisol depletion. The experience feels like a rival. The present self and the future self do not always want the same things, but they share a nervous system, a body that will carry the consequences of tonight's choices. Research on intertemporal choice consistently finds that when people are encouraged to visualize specific moments in their future self's experience, not outcomes, but moments, the temporal discount rate decreases and future-oriented behavior increases. The future self becomes real enough to factor in, not as an obligation, as a version of yourself worth considering. The relationship between gratitude and procrastination is one of the lesser studied but robust findings in positive psychology. Studies measuring dispositional gratitude alongside procrastination scores found a consistent negative correlation. Higher gratitude was associated with lower procrastination rates and lower avoidance behavior. The proposed mechanism is that gratitude shifts attention toward present sufficiency rather than future inadequacy, reducing the self-threat that drives avoidance. The gratitude that reduces procrastination is not forced or performed. It is the genuine recognition, even briefly, that the present moment contains something real. The science of sleep hygiene intersects with procrastination in a place most sleep advice ignores the window between intention to sleep and actual sleep onset. Research shows that activities in this window directly shape the brain's ability to complete the transition. Individuals using it for low stimulation activity, gentle reading, breathing, quiet reflection, show shorter sleep latency than those using it for screens or incomplete task review. The body knows how to sleep. What it needs is an environment that stops adding new signals. The full arc of the research lands in a place that is neither comfortable nor condemning. The person who freezes is not broken. The person who lies awake reviewing the day is not failing at recovery. Both are responding predictably to the neurological cost of caring deeply while lacking the conditions, the safety, the clarity, the physical resource to act on that caring without threat. What reduces procrastination reliably is psychological safety. The felt sense that beginning is not a referendum on worth. The body already knows how to rest. Sleep does not need to be constructed. It needs to be allowed. The nervous system that has been managing today's open loops will, when the load is reduced, cross into sleep with quiet efficiency. What stands between wakefulness and rest is an activation level, residual signal from unresolved things that hasn't been given permission to quiet. Permission is not a thought. It is the gradual withdrawal of attention from the loop and the slow return to the body's own rhythm. The science of procrastination ends where it began, at the body. The freeze that prevents beginning and the wakefulness that prevents rest are not enemies of the self. They are attempts by a genuinely protective nervous system to manage what it cannot control: uncertainty, judgment, the gap between who you are and who you are trying to become. The research does not say the freeze should be overcome. It says the freeze should be understood. And that understanding, arrived at as felt knowledge rather than intellectual information, changes what the nervous system needs to keep you safe. There is a version of tomorrow that is already possible, not the version requiring perfect conditions or the absence of fear. The version that begins from where you actually are, tired, imperfect, carrying today's weight, and takes the first step the nervous system can tolerate. Research on behavioral momentum has shown that this first step, however small, changes the system's trajectory more than any amount of planning done without beginning. The body learns from motion. It does not learn from intention alone. The sleep that follows a day of avoidance is not a failure. It is the next part of the cycle. The glymphatic system will clear what accumulated. The hippocampus will process what was held. The amygdala will recalibrate overnight. The prefrontal cortex, restored by even a few hours of quality sleep, will arrive tomorrow with more of what it lacked today: the capacity to begin, The night is not where the day is judged. The night is where the day is metabolized. There is a difference. The self that lies awake at midnight, reviewing what was not done today, is the same self that will wake tomorrow with a chance to begin again. Not because willpower will have returned or the fear disappeared, but because the body will have rested, the threat system will have quieted, and the forward-moving mechanism will be briefly, genuinely available before the new day accumulates its own weight. The window is real. It arrives every morning. The question is only whether tonight allowed enough restoration for that window to be used. Procrastination is not laziness. It is a disconnection between the self that cares about the future and the self that must act in the present. Across a gap kept open by fear. Fear of inadequacy. Fear of judgment. Fear of what completion might reveal. The healing is not discipline or willpower. It is the gradual, deeply human experience of learning that beginning is safe, that the task does not define the worth of the person attempting it, that the freeze was protection, not character. That rest is not a reward for completion. It is the condition that makes completion possible. After 100 facts about the space between knowing and doing, you have been carrying both tonight. The knowledge of what the day asked, and the body that couldn't quite answer. That is not a contradiction. It is what it means to be a nervous system that cares about something. The freeze that held you today was not your failure. It was the cost of caring about something so much that beginning felt like the most exposed thing a person could do. Let your entire being settle now, the way a room settles after everyone has finally stopped asking something of it. Just wait. Just breath. Just the particular quiet of a night that has said everything it needed to say. What changes? Slowly. When the science finally names what you already lived through, is not the task. The task is the same. The deadline is the same. The list is unchanged. What changes is the self standing in front of it. The freeze was not evidence of your inadequacy. It was evidence of your investment. The nervous system doesn't lock down over things it doesn't care about. It reserves that response for the things that feel consequential enough to get wrong. Tonight, in the dark, with the accounting done and the day complete, what remains is not the unfinished list. What remains is this: the person who couldn't begin today is the same person who stayed awake, caring about it. The caring was never the problem. The gap between caring and acting has a mechanism, and mechanisms, when they are understood, can be worked with. Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but gradually, with less threat and more patience than the system has been given. You are not broken. You are protecting something. You can rest now. The Psychology for Sleep playlist has been returning to this question from many directions. The space between what we intend and what we do, and what lives in the gap. The next video carries it further, toward the part tonight only pointed at. That video is waiting whenever you are ready. You can allow these thoughts to settle now, like the last item taken off a list that has been carried too long. Finally set down somewhere safe. Let your shoulders release into the surface beneath them. Sleep carries you to where no accounting is being kept. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well. Quiet one. The freeze was always care in a nervous system that didn't know it was safe to begin. where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.